Page 557. Good morning. Chapter 22 is still on Part 3 of Volume 2. We are building. After everything that has been said about the camps, the question simply bursts out. That's enough, but was the prisoners' labor profitable to the state? And if it was not profitable, then was it worthwhile undertaking the whole archipelago? In the camps themselves, both points of view on this were to be found among the sects, and we used to love to argue about it. Of course, if one believed the leaders, there was nothing to argue about on the subject of the use of prisoners' labor. Comrade Molotov, once the second-ranking man in the state, declared at the 6th Congress of the Soviets of the USSR, quote, "We did this earlier, we are doing it now, and we are going to go on doing it in the future. It is profitable to society. It is useful to the criminals," unquote. Not profitable to the state, note that, but to society itself, and useful to the criminals. And we will go on doing it in the future. So, what is there to argue about? Yes, the entire system of the Stalin decades, when first the construction projects were planned and only afterward on the recruitment of criminals to man them took place, confirms that the government evidently had no doubt of the economic profitability of the camps. Economics went before justice, but it is quite evident that the question posed needs to be made more precise and to be split into parts. Did the camps justify themselves in a political and social sense? Did they justify themselves economically? Did they pay for themselves? Despite the apparent similarity of the second and third questions, there is a difference. It is not difficult to answer the first question. For Stalin's purposes, the camps were a wonderful place in which he could herd millions as a form of intimidation, and so it appears that they lucrated to an enormous social stratum. The camps were also profitable. To an enormous social stratum, The countless number of camp officers they gave to the military service safely in the rear, special rations, pay, uniforms, apartments, and a position in society. Likewise, they sheltered throngs of jailers and hard-headed guards who dozed atop camp towers, while 13-year-old boys were driven into trade schools. And all these parasites upheld the archipelago with all their strength as a nest of serf exploitation. They feared a universal amnesty like the plague. But we have already understood that by no means only those with different ideas, by no means only those who had got off the trodden path marked out by Stalin were in the camps. The recruitment into camps obviously and clearly exceeded political needs, exceeded the needs of terror. It was proportionate, although perhaps in Stalin's head alone, to economic plans. Yes, had not the camps and exile arisen out of the crisis, unemployment of the 20s. From 1930 on, it was not that the digging of canals was invented for dozing camps, but the camps were urgently scraped together for the envisioned canals. It was not the number of genuine criminals or even doubtful persons which determined the density of the court's activities, but the requisitions of the economic establishment and the beginning of the Belomor Canal. There was an immediate shortage of Solovetsky Island sects, and it became clear that 3 years was too short and too unprofitable a sentence for 58s that they had to serve out 2 5-year plans taken together. The reason why the camps provided economically profitable, had proved economically profitable, had been foreseen as far back as Thomas More, great-grandfather of socialism, in his Utopia. The labor of the sex was needed for degrading and particularly heavy work which no one under socialism would wish to perform, for work in remote and primitive localities where it would not be possible to construct housing, schools, hospitals, and stores for many years to come, for work with pick and spade in the flowering of the 20th century, for the erection of the great construction projects of socialism, and the economic means for them did not yet exist. On the great Billimore Canal, even an automobile was a rarity. Everything was created, as they say, in camp with fart power. On the even larger Moscow-Volga Canal, 7 times bigger in scale of work than the Billimore Canal, and comparable to the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal. 80 miles of canal were dug to a depth of over 16 feet and a top width of 280 feet, almost all of it with pick, shovel, and wheelbarrow. The future bottom of the Rybinsk Sea was covered with forest expanses. All of them were cut down by hand, and Marion electric saw was seen there, and the branches and brushwood were burned by total invalids, who, except prisoners, would have worked at logging 10 hours a day in addition to marching 4 miles through the woods in pre-dawn darkness, and the same distance back at night in a temperature of -20, and knowing in a year no other rest day than May 1st and November 7th, Gulag, 1937. And who other than the archipelago natives would have grubbed out stumps in water, or hauled on their backs the boxes of mixed ore, of mined ore, in the open goldfields of the Kolyma, or have dragged cut timber a half-mile from the Coin River, a tributary of the Vim, through deep snow on finished timber sledge runners, harnessed up in pairs in a horse collar, both upholstered with tatters and rotten clothing to make them softer, and the horse collar worn over one shoulder. True, the authorized journalist Chekhov assures us the Komsomolsk built the city of Komsomolsk on the Amur in 1932. Thus, they cut down trees without axes, having no smithies, got no bread, and died from scurvy. And he is delighted. Oh, how heroically we built! And would it not be more to the point to be indignant? Who was it, hating their own people, who sent them to build in such conditions? But what's the use of indignation? We at least know what kind of Komsomolsk built Komsomolsk. And today they write that those Komsomols founded Magadan too. And who could be sent down in the Tezgan mines for a 12-hour workday of dry drilling? The silicate dust from the ore there floated about in clouds, and there were no masks, and in 4 months they were sent off to die of irreversible silicosis. Who could be sent down coal mine shafts on lifts without brake shoes, into mine tunnels without pit props, without protection against flooding? For whom alone in the 20th century was it unnecessary to spend money on wasteful workmen's safety precautions? And how was it then that the camps were economically unprofitable? Read. in the dead road by Poboji. That description of how they disembarked from and unloaded the lighters on the Taz River, that Arctic Iliad of the Stalinist epoch, how the savage tundra, where a human foot had never trod, and ant-like prisoners guarded by an ant-like convoy dragged thousands of shipped-in logs on their back, and built wharves, and laid down rails, and rolled into that tundra locomotives and freight cars which were fated never to leave there under their own power. They slept 5 hours a day on the bare ground, surrounded by signboards saying camp compound. And he describes further how the prisoners laid a telephone line through the tundra. They lived in lean-tos made of branches and moss. Mosquitoes devoured their unprotected bodies, and their clothing never dried out from the swamp mud, still less their footgear. The route had been surveyed, hit or miss, and poorly laid out, and was doomed to be redrawn, and there was no timber nearby for poles, and they had to go off to either side 2-story or 3-day expeditions in order to drag in poles from out there. There was unfortunately no other Poboji to tell how, before the war, another railroad was built from Kotlas to Vorkuta, where beneath each tie 2 heads were left. And what kind of a railroad was it when before that railroad they lay alongside in a simple road of ties through an impenetrable forest built by skinny arms, dull axes, and do-nothing bayonets? Now who would have done that without prisoners? And how on earth could the camp not be profitable? The camps were uniquely profitable in terms of the submissiveness of the slave labor and its cheapness. No, it's not just cheap, it cost nothing, because in antiquity money did have to be paid for a slave, whereas no one paid anything to buy a camp inmate. Even at the post-war camp conferences, the industrial serf owners admitted that the Chekhov played a big role in the work, in the rear, in the victory. No one will ever engrave their forgotten names on a marble tombstone placed over their bones. How irreplaceable the camps were was discovered in Khrushchev's time, during bothersome, vociferous Komsomol appeals for volunteers for the Virgin Lands and construction projects in Siberia. The question of the camps paying for themselves was, however, a different question. The state saliva had been flowing over this for a long time, as long ago as the statutes of places of confinement in 1921. There had been the plea that the places of confinement must, if possible, pay their way with the labor of the prisoners. From 1922 on, certain local executive committees, going against their worker and peasant character, manifested tendencies of an apolitical pragmatism, and in particular, not only did they seek to have the places of confinement pay their own way, but they also tried, in addition, to squeeze profits out of them for the local budget to make them self-supporting. Plus, the confinement in 1928, in 1928, at the first all-union conference of penitentiary executives, there was stubborn insistence that there must be an obligatory reimbursement to the state by the entire network of enterprises of places of confinement of expenditures by the state on these places of confinement. So they wanted to have their little camps, and free too. From 1925, all the corrective labor institutions of the country were included in the economic plan, and on January 1st, 1931, It was decreed that all camps and colonies in the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic and the Ukraine were to be completely self-supporting. And what happened next? Instant success, of course. In 1932, the jurists proclaimed triumphantly, the expenditures of corrective labor institutions have been reduced. This can be believed. And the conditions in which those deprived of freedom are maintained are improving with each year. We would be surprised, and we would try to find out why this happened and how, if we ourselves hadn't experienced on our own backs just exactly how that maintenance improved later on. But if you come to think about it, it wasn't so very different at all. What was required to make expenditures on camps equal the income from them? The expenditures, as we read, were being reduced. To increase income was even simpler, by squeezing the prisoners. If in the Solovetsky Island period of the archipelago, an official 40% discount was applied to forced labor, the assumption being, for some reason, that labor performed under a club was not so productive. Then, as early as the Belamar Canal, when the stomach scale of compensation was being introduced and hungry labor was the most productive in the world, Ukrainian camp administration, when ordered to become self-supporting in 1931, decided directly to increase the productivity of labor in the coming year by neither more nor less than 242%. In comparison with the preceding years, in other words, by 2.5 times, and without any mechanization. And how scientifically this worked out, 240 and another 2%. The only thing the comrades did know was what this is called is the Great Leap Forward beneath 3 red banners. And you see how Gulag knew in which direction the wind was blowing. Right then was when the immorality historic 6 conditions of Comrade Stalin poured forth, among them self-support. But we in Gulag already have it. And once again, the use of specialists. But for us, this was the easiest of all, to take the engineers off general work, assign them to posts as work trustees. The beginning of the 30s was the most privileged period for the technical intelligentsia, the archipelago. Almost none of them were forced to drag out an existence of general work, and even newcomers were immediately established in their field of specialization. Up to that time, in the 20s, the engineers and technicians perished for nothing on general work because they were not deployed or made use of. After this period, from 1937 right up to the 50s, self-support was forgotten, and all the historic 6 conditions along with it. And the main thing historically became vigilance, and the infiltration of engineers one by one into trusty ranks alternated with waves of expelling them all to general work. Anyways, it was cheaper to have a prisoner, either a prisoner engineer rather than a free person. No wages had to be paid him. Once again, profit. Once again, self-support. Once again, Comrade Stalin was right. So this line had to be drawn out of the distant past, and they had carried it on correctly too. The archipelago had cost nothing. But no matter how they huffed and puffed and broke all their nails on the crags, no matter how they corrected the plan fulfillment sheets 20 times over, and wore them down to holes in the paper, the archipelago did not pay its own way, and it never will. The income from it will never equal the expenses, and our young workers and peasants' state, subsequently elderly state of all people, is forced to haul this filthy, bloody rag along on its back. And here's why. The first principal cause was the lack of conscientiousness of the prisoners, the negligence of those stupid slaves. No, you couldn't expect, not only couldn't you expect any socialist self-sacrifice of them, but they didn't even manifest simple capitalist diligence. All they were on the lookout for was ways to spoil their footgear and not go out to work, to wreck the crane, to buckle a wheel, to break a spade, to sink a pail, anything for a pretext to sit down and smoke. All that the camp inmates made for their own dear state was openly and blatantly botched. You could break the bricks they made with your bare hands. The paint would peel off the panels, the plaster would fall off, the posts would fall down, tables rock, legs fall out, handles come off. Carelessness and mistakes were everywhere, and it could happen that you had to tear off a roof already nailed on, redig the ditch which they had filled in, demolish with a crowbar and a drill a wall they had already built. In the 50s, they brought a new Swedish turbine to Steplag. It came in a frame made of log, like a hut. It was winter, and it was cold, and so the cursed sex crawled into this frame between the beams and the turbine and started a bonfire to get warm. The silver soldering on the blades melted, and they threw the turbine out. It cost 3.7 million rubles. Now that's being self-supporting of you. And in the presence of the sex, and this was the second reason, the free employees didn't care either, and they thought they were working not for themselves but for some stranger or other, and they stole a lot. They stole a great deal. They were building tubs, but the tubs had been supplied to match. They were building tubs in an apartment building, and the free employees stole several bathtubs, but the tubs were being supplied to match the number of apartments. So how could they hand over the apartment building as completed? They could not confess to the construction superintendent, of course. He was triumphantly showing the official acceptance committee around the first stair landing. Yes, and he did not omit to take them into every bathroom and show them each tub. And then he took the committee to the second floor landing and the third, not hurrying there either, and kept going into all the bathrooms. And meanwhile, the adroit and experienced sex, under the leadership of an experienced plumber, broke bathtubs out of the apartments on the first landing, hauled them upstairs on tiptoe on the fourth floor, and hurriedly installed them and puttied them in before the committee's arrival. And it was their lookout if they let the wool be pulled over their eyes. They ought to have shown it in a film comedy, but they wouldn't allow it. There's nothing funny in our life. Everything funny takes place in the West. The third cause was the sex lack of independence, their inability to live without jailers, without camp administration, without guards, without camp perimeter, complete with watchtowers, without a planning and production section, and records and classification section, a security operations section, a cultural and educational section, and without higher camp administrations right up to Gulag itself, without censorship and without penalty isolators, without strict regiment brigades, without trustees, without stockroom clerks and warehouses, their inability to move around without convoys and dogs, and so the state had to maintain at least one custodian for each working native. And every custodian had a family. Well, and good at that it was, but where were all these custodians on to live on? And there were some bright engineers who pointed out a fourth reason as well, that they claimed the necessity of setting up a perimeter fence at every step, of strengthening the convoy, of allotting a supplementary convoy, interfered with the engineers' technical maneuverability, as, for example, during the disembarkation on the river Taz. And because of this, so they claimed, everything was done late and cost more. But this was already an objective reason. This was a pretext. Summon them to the party bureau, give them a good scolding, and the cause will disappear. Let them break their heads, and they'll find a solution. And then, beyond all these reasons, there were the natural and fully condonable miscalculations of the leadership itself. As Comrade Lenin said, only the person who does nothing makes no mistakes. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.